What's that? Oh, nice. Where? Irvine.
Welcome, everyone, to our Land Use Committee meeting of February 12th, 2018, Monday. I'm Katie Tang, chair of this committee, and we are joined by Supervisor Safai, and Supervisor Aaron Peskin is filling in for Supervisor Kim today. Our clerk is Victor Young, and from SFGov TV, I'd like to thank Nona Melkonian and Charles Kremenek. We are also joined today by Supervisor Catherine Stephanie. Mr. Clerk, are there any announcements?
Yes, please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the February 27th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Thank you very much. Can you please call item 1?
Item number 1, ordinance amending the planning code to establish the Gary Masonic Special Use District in the area generally bounded by Gary Boulevard to the south and Masonic Avenue to the east, and assessors parcels block number 1071, lots numbers 1 and 4 to the north and west respectively.
Thank you. I will defer to Supervisor Stephanie first, since this is in her district.
Thank you, Chair Tang. Colleagues, you heard this item last week and accepted the special use district amendments, allowing the project to go from 21 units to 95 units while the building remains the same size. Most important, it allows the number of affordable housing units in the project to go from 3 to 22. That's more affordable units than the total number of units in the original project. Again, these amendments raise the inclusionary from 18% to 23%, broken down as 10% at 55% of the AMI, 4% at 80% AMI, 4% at 110% AMI, and 5% at 120% of AMI. And the appropriate AMI bands will apply. The second recommendation is around car share spaces. And the Commission recommended 4 of the spaces be reserved for car share. So on the advice of the City Attorney, the amendments increased the findings regarding car share and then required 4 of the 16 parking spaces to be reserved for car share use. Again, I just want to thank the Laurel Heights Improvement Association and Anza Vista neighbors for being so forward-thinking, and for the developers for being so transparent and working so well with the neighbors. This dense project in a neighborhood that hasn't seen any new housing is very welcomed, and I just want to thank everyone for their hard work on seeing this across the finish line. I was aide to Supervisor Farrell when this started over 2 years ago, and to see it now is just incredible. So I'm happy to bring this uniquely dense labor and neighborhood supported project forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Stephanie. Any other colleagues? Supervisor Safai?
No, I'll
Okay.
reserve.
All right. And if we don't have any questions for planning staff as well, then I will open this item up to public comment. I have 2 speaker cards, Kathy DiVincenzi and Richard Frisbee, and anyone else who'd like to come up to speak, please line up.
Good afternoon, Supervisors Tang, Safai, Stephanie, and Peskin. I'm Kathy DiVincenzi from the Laurel Heights Improvement Association, and I am very happy to support the project before you today. Because this project is on a small 12,000-foot irregular-sized lot, the density increase through the special use district would allow the housing units to be increased from 21 to 95 units, which would serve the city's need for more housing. I think this density accommodation is reasonable because the building would conform with the applicable height limit, and this would strike a reasonable balance. And the 95 housing units would be better than commercial use in the majority of the building, which was the first iteration proposed, although we supported that too. A taller building would have shaded the windows and gardens of the homes of the buildings on Emerson and Hurt, the longtime middle-income residents there who were commissioning a shadow study before the project was revised. And we worked with them, and we appreciate that the developers, Cyrus and Kabir, worked with the neighbors on the issues of the project design and the height and the nature of the roof screenings. And this is not always the case, but we actually had a free flow of information with these developers, and because they were willing to work with the neighborhood. So we thank them for that. We support the building. It's within the height limit. And we also support the affordable housing increase because it'll provide 5% more for the middle income group, which is so needed because we're losing the middle class in San Francisco. And the developers responded to our request for information in a timely fashion. And they also agreed to our request for a condition of approval that, to the extent allowed by codes, that any roof screening be transparent in order to minimize impacts on the neighborhood. So we had a collaborative process, and we thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon, Supervisor and staff. I'm Richard Frisbee with Laurel Heights Improvement Association. I would just like to thank the 4 parties involved in this: Planning Department, Christopher May, the developers Cyrus and Kabir, supervisors past and present, now Supervisor Stephanie, and also the neighborhoods, people who got involved in that. I think that the open, transparent process worked well. We didn't always agree, but we always agreed to discuss and have an open dialogue, and from that came what we believe is a productive, useful development in our neighborhood. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other members of the public? Seeing none, public comment on this item is closed. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I just want to acknowledge the model work that the developers and the community have done here. And I think it's a sign that neighborhoods that some might think are resistant to more housing and dense housing is untrue. And I was pleased to hear Ms. DiVincenzi speak about her support for raising what otherwise would have been a 21-unit development to almost 100 units. And the reason, before I make the motion to send this to the full board with recommendation, that I wanted to speak is because there's a bill that's been introduced in the state Senate, Senate Bill 827, that would really take away some of the zoning powers that local municipalities like San Francisco have had now for since the beginning of time. And here's proof positive that we really don't need an SB 827. We know how to handle it locally, and I will be introducing a measure at the Board of Supervisors tomorrow and hope to get the support of my colleagues in opposing SB 827, as the League of Cities has already done and as LA is preparing to do. And with that, I would like to make a motion to send this item to the full board with recommendation.
Thank you. And before we do that, Supervisor Safai.
No, I was just going to make a motion, just congratulate Supervisor Stephanie on one of the first pieces of legislation that she's able to lead on, and also something that she started when she was an aide. So I think that's pretty great, and also to have neighborhood support to take something that was diminutive in the overall context of what's needed in San Francisco and make it an impactful project without having negative impacts on the neighborhood, I think is commendable. So I commend the neighborhood leaders and the developer and our new supervisor on what a wonderful project to begin her term on the board with.
Thank you very much.
So I'll second that motion.
Okay. And I mean, personally, I'm a little bummed it wasn't Home SF that we're using here, but that's okay. This is a better project for the neighborhood. All right. With that, there was a motion to send forth with positive recommendation to the full board. We'll do that without objection. And before we move on to item 2, I neglected to ask if we could have a motion to excuse Supervisor Kim, or do we need to do that?
Yes.
Okay. So motion to excuse Supervisor Kim from committee, and Supervisor Peskin is replacing her. Motion, someone?
So moved.
We'll do that without objection. All right, item 2, please.
Item number 2, ordinance amending the planning code to regulate restaurant and bar use in the Jackson Square Special Use District, Broadway Neighborhood Commercial District, North Beach Neighborhood Commercial District, and the North Beach Special Use District, amending the Jackson Square Special Use District to require a conditional use permit for office uses, business services, and institutional uses fronting on Pacific Avenue.
Thank you. We'll turn it over to our sponsor, Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Supervisor Safai. This is an ordinance that contains a number of non-substantive cleanup amendments to the Broadway and North Beach NCDs and North Beach SUD zoning tables. But principally, the ordinance contains amendments to the Jackson Square Special Use District relative to a increasing number of restaurants, limited restaurants, and bar uses in the area. This limited control on bars and restaurants already exists in other parts of the northeast corner of the city, particularly in the North Beach NCD, which saw a huge number of additional restaurants and bars and an oversaturation within its boundaries. And in North Beach in particular, those controls have helped to minimize speculative commercial rent practices in the neighborhood and cultivate and maintain a diverse array of retail and other community serving uses. So the folks in Jackson Square wanted the same thing. Jackson Square, as you know, has the largest number of pre-1870 commercial buildings in the city. It's a very small, discrete geography that encompasses about 5 blocks and has an increasing number of residential units within it. And in that very small geography, currently there are about 17 bars and restaurants sprinkled among an array of unique and thriving ground floor commercial uses. Historically, it was an antique destination zone, and today includes antique stores, art galleries, bookstores, architecture firms, and more recently an emerging community of tailors and retail clothing establishments. So I'm very happy to say that around the bigger conversation about the Amazon effect and what's happening with retail in general, which I know was the subject of a long hearing recently, the vacancy rate in Jackson Square as well as in North Beach is remained really quite healthy as set forth in the Planning Department's staff report. So long story short, we have a healthy vacancy rate, and it's the threat of restaurants and bars that can afford higher rents and are displacing the mix of art gallery and retail spaces that this legislation addresses. I also wanted to note that the legislative file for this matter didn't include several letters of support, most of which went to the Planning Commission when they heard and recommended this without modification on January 11th, and I've included those colleagues in handouts that I've given you, and they are now part of the board packet. And you will see letters there, including from the Small Business Commission that unanimously voted in favor of the legislation without modification, as well as letters from the Jackson Square Historic District Association, which is a combination of businesses and residential members, as well as 2 letters from Homeowners Association in the area asking for our support. And with that, colleagues, I respectfully request your support for this item.
Thank you. Supervisor Safai.
So just to clarify, I think you said this pretty clearly, but I just want to understand. This is to protect the area from additional restaurants and bars and others coming in and displacing existing restaurant, bars, and other uses? Or is it to ensure that existing retail that's non-restaurant bars and uses are protected?
So why don't we have Diego Sanchez come up and give the staff report? And I just wanted to note, Madam Chair, that our former board member, Bevan Dufty, is in the chambers.
Welcome.
Diego Sanchez with the Planning Department. Supervisors, as mentioned, the Planning Commission heard this ordinance on January 11th of this year. They voted 6-1 in support of the ordinance without any modification, so as proposed by Supervisor Peskin. The Commission believes that the existing retail conditions in Jackson Square are working. It's an interesting and historic place with attractive retail and sufficient eating and drinking places, as well as with the mentioned low vacancy rate. The ordinance, they believe, and they mentioned, will help keep what's working. And Supervisor Safai, if you could repeat, did you have a question?
My question was, so I understand the use that you're trying to, the existing uses are. Do you want to jump in, Aaron?
Sure.
Supervisor? Sorry.
You bet. So if you will look to page 4, which is section 249.25, this is one about intensification and increase in square footage.
Right.
And 2, you'll see that section 2, section B2 sub B, which is conditional uses, says restaurants, limited restaurants, and bars uses may be permitted as a conditional use on the first story through the procedures set forth in section 303, which is the conditional use section of the code. only if the zoning administrator first determines that the proposed new restaurant, limited restaurant, or bar would occupy a space that is currently or was last legally occupied by one of the uses described below, and those uses are a bar, a restaurant, a limited restaurant. So bottom line, the answer to your question is that bars and restaurants may replace bars and restaurants, but may not displace retail uses.
Got it. Okay. So can I just make something for any of the restaurants, bars, or other uses similar to that can't locate here? They're welcome to come to my district because we're encouraging those. That's what I thought this was
And the
intended to
sunset.
do. And the sunset.
Outer sunset.
Okay.
But since we have a higher
Duly
vacancy rate and are a little bit more in demand, I made this joke during cannabis, and I think it's a nice lead-in because we talked about limiting the uses and the amount of licenses around the city. But Type 47 licenses, I think we have 5 in our district, and maybe one of those is really being used in the appropriate manner. So anyone, just for the record, that wants to use their Type 47 license, and come to the Excelsior District 11, and I fully support this piece of legislation.
And Supervisor Safai will offer a finder's fee.
And by the way, I wish we had these problems in District 11.
Ditto. Okay. All right. Any members of the public who wish to speak during public comment on item 2, please come on up. Okay. Seeing none, then public comment is closed. Supervisor Peskin?
I would like to make a motion to send this item to the full board with recommendation.
All right. And we'll do that without objection. Thank you. Item 3, please.
Item number 3, ordinance amending the planning code to revise zoning map sheet ZN 06 to rezone assessors parcel blocks number AB 2719C, lot 23, located at Burnett Avenue and Burnett Avenue North, from public to residential mixed districts, low density RM-1, rezoning a portion of Burnett Avenue North, generally bounded by AB 2745, lot number 36, and AB 2719C, lot number 023 to RM1.
Thank you very much. Supervisor Peskin, is your name still on the roster? or is
I see Supervisor Sheehy's staff. I spoke to Supervisor
Yes.
Sheehy earlier and understand that they would like this item continue to the call of the chair.
We
but
will let
absolutely.
Holden Lambright come up and speak to that.
Hi, good afternoon, Chair Tang and members of the committee. I'm here on behalf of Supervisor Sheehy's office, and we would like to continue this item at the call of the chair. And John Givner, the Deputy City Attorney, is here who can answer any questions that you might have.
How about we'll turn it over to our Deputy City Attorney, just explain why we have to continue this item.
Sure, Deputy City Attorney John Givner. This item is part of a package of legislation that's connected to a settlement of litigation that's now pending in the Government Audit and Oversight Committee. The plan is to have that settlement ordinance move forward along with this ordinance and an additional piece of legislation that has not yet been introduced to vacate the street. So once that piece of legislation is introduced, we will work with the clerk's office and Supervisor Sheehy's office and your office to get everything scheduled so they move together.
Great, thank you for that. So why don't we open up item 3 to public comment then? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed. Can we get a motion to continue to the call of the chair for item 3? Okay, thank you. We'll do that without objection. Item 4, please.
Item number 4, hearing on the Year 2 report of the Cannabis State Legalization Task Force and requesting the Cannabis State Legalization Task Force to report.
Thank you very much. This item was sponsored by, or is sponsored by Supervisor Cohen. I don't know if someone was going to come and make opening remarks or if we're just going to call on Mr. Allen here. Okay. Mr. Terrence Allen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have copies at the request of the clerk of the presentation that I would like to make available to the committee members. If we could have the slide, please. Thank you. I would like to begin with some introductions, if I may. My name is Terrence Allen. I'm pleased to be the chair of the committee, but I am actually one of 3 co-chairs, and I would like to introduce now my 2 co-chairs who sit behind me, Sarah Payan, who sits at the seat for 2 years of cannabis legislative advocacy, and Jen Garcia, our labor advocate. We're also joined by Nicole Elliott in the box, as I'm inclined to call it. Nicole is now the director of the Office of Cannabis, and as the task force will be moving from its facilitation role with the Department of Public Health to the Office of Cannabis, this is the perfect time for this marriage to be introduced to you, the board, as it was your idea to come up with this task force. In doing this, the Department of Public Health and their role shifts. They are now deeply involved in the regulatory framework and figuring out how to make all of this work. But it would be a mistake not to recognize both Israel Nieves Rivera and Gretchen Paulé, who worked within the department for over 2 years to bring these issues forward in a comprehensive way. And in concluding my introductions, Michelle at Harder Company and Janine at Harder Company have been instrumental in bringing us forward in a logical fashion so that the continuity of each topic item can be brought forward to its conclusion. And they are joined by Tim Morrison, who will be part of the team for this year. So with that, those are my thank yous. And if I get the right button, down, button, see. Which one is it? Yeah, it should. Okay, there we go. Okay, we had one too many buttons pushed. We have to begin by taking a look at what is the task force, what did it do in year 2, and what is its vision in year 3. So the task force had in its purpose the early job of facilitating a conversation between the community, the department heads, and the city. This was prior to understanding that we were going to have any legislation, let alone a ballot initiative, pass. And so in doing so, the task force was generally set up to advise the mayor, the supervisors, and city departments. Now, as we refined this over time, we are now proposing that the year 3 goal be that the task force will review and recommend policy in 3 main topic areas: regulatory, land use, and social justice and equity, and we'll get to that. So we've presented on year 1, you are now being presented on year 2, and let's look at year 2 in review. So year 2 in review builds on year 1. Year 1, we had no legal framework in which to work. We decided as a task force that from community input, public safety and the social environment were key, as well as land use and social justice and regulation and city agency framework. As this process evolved into the recommendations for year 2, they became more formalized, and you will note they follow the legislation that you ultimately passed this past year. Retail, licensing, actually here in the city we're calling it permitting. So retail permitting, non-retail permitting, what impact that has on land use, what changes we need to make, and of course the most all-important equity and social justice component. That was our year 1 and year 2 framework. Out of those framework documents came 98 recommendations, and about 2/3 of those recommendations made it into your legislative and lawmaking process. And we thank you for taking those tours. We thank you for participating in all of the work that was required to be able to get months and months of input from the task force and combine it down into a few sentences that you could use in your process. We're proud to have been a part of that, and the success is shown in that slide. Now we move into the actual meat and potatoes of what we are doing. So we'll start with non-retail licensing. And I'm going to introduce Sarah Payan, my co-chair, who will come up and talk about what non-retail licensing and what that permitting system looks like here in the city.
Thank you, Terrence. In year 2, the task force discussed non-retail licensing and made 29 recommendations. Number 5, priority licensing. We recommend that existing permit holders in good standing or have been displaced as a result of federal intervention to receive priority processing and licensing status in the city and county of San Francisco. This recommendation should not conflict with social justice prioritized permitting processing recommendations. Number 2, new local licensing. We agreed that in addition to state-defined license types, the following local license types should be created. A virtual dispensary, which would be a physical location used for delivery with no walk-in retail. Manufacturing 6B special baking cooking license. Consumption lounge, where one can bring their own product, whether that be entertainment, restaurants, yoga studio, or gym. And temporary events, which would include Cannabis Cup, cultural events, and farmers market examples. It should be noted the above licenses would not include retail activity except in the case of micro businesses. Consumption lounges and temporary events should be allowed in San Francisco. The city should look into whether a license is necessary in these cases. From an advocacy standpoint and social justice standpoint, and also compassion, consumption lounges also support safe access for patients using cannabis who might lose their housing if they medicate on the premises, as in Section 8 housing. As we have seen on the dispensary side, safe access to cannabis lowers usage rates of opiates and benzodiazepines, of which abuse is epidemic in proportion in our country. For social equity, workforce development, and business ownership, 26 states, San Francisco should engage community members.
I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yes.
Are you moving the slides? Because the slides aren't moving.
Oh, my slides aren't moving.
Yeah, so
Here we
just
go.
so the because we
Thank
can
you so
follow
much.
along, but the viewers will not be.
Sorry about that. Social equity, workforce development,
sorry.
and business ownership. So for retail licensing, I'm sorry here. In our discussion on retail licensing, we made 44 recommendations. Actually, I'm sorry, I think I did really skip. Actually, no, I didn't. I'm sorry. We are actually back in the old slide. We were talking about consumption under that as well. Because that is actually talking about temporary events, farmers market examples. They should be allowed. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Here we go. So we are actually talking about consumption lounges in both of these areas for the non-retail and the retail, because the non-retail would be a lounge where you were able to bring your own cannabis to consume. So there wouldn't be any purchasing involved in that, which when we are looking at people who are living in Section 8 housing, low-income individuals, they shouldn't have to be pressured to purchase merchandise in order to have a safe consumption area. And then we're going to 11, license portability. San Francisco should issue local non-retail licenses to the operator and take steps to ensure that the licenses are portable so that we may close a loophole allowing takeovers of already established cannabis business locations. And then number 7, information and the federal government, security of information, and local government. Local licensing agencies should do everything within their legal power to prevent disclosure of sensitive business and personal information to federal agencies. To reduce the risk of theft, local licensing agencies should keep non-retail facility physical addresses discreet, with mailing addresses as an appropriate way of providing information. Now we're going to go to the next slide for retail licensing. In our discussion on retail licensing, the task force made 44 recommendations. On-site consumption, so we are going back to that. 19, San Francisco should allow on-site consumption at cannabis retail locations, and these locations must include proper ventilation systems. As we go on to social equity, which includes workforce development and business ownership, San Francisco should engage community members in the target populations, people of color and formerly incarcerated persons, and within these groups prioritize women, transitional age youth ages 21 to 24, and LGBTQ people, along with workforce development organizations, community-based organizations, and other key stakeholders to develop strategies to reduce economic barriers to enter the cannabis industry as workforce or entrepreneurs. San Francisco should reduce annual permitting fees according to the percentage employment of target populations, 25% off for 25% employment of target populations, 50% off for 50% of employment of target populations. The task force encourages legislation to address compassion programs and supportive services that may fall outside the permitting system currently adopted. As a seat representing advocacy, I feel it's important to note the industry began the Compassionate Cannabis program by providing cannabis to those who didn't have financial means to purchase at retail. The Compassion program has a history of improving patients' quality of life, and we firmly believe that our current permitting system should make permanent the practice of compassion. As many of our most critically ill patients live on fixed incomes and cannot afford their medicine, these programs are essential for their survival. San Francisco should encourage nonprofit models and make nonprofit licenses available for cannabis organizations that provide compassion programs and supportive services, and also should provide incentives, for example, tax and licensing incentives to cannabis organizations that provide compassion programs and supportive services. And then we're going to go on to my colleague, Jen Garcia.
Thank you, supervisors. In our discussion on land use, the task force made 17 recommendations. The recommendation to expand where cannabis businesses could be was made with the desire to include cannabis in areas where other equivalent businesses could operate. There's also a grandfather recommendation to protect from the impacts of future sensitive uses that may choose to locate near an existing cannabis business. The task force again feels strongly that consumption lounges should be addressed sooner rather than later. Community engagement must continue to be a part of the application process. The city should encourage and promote a good neighbor culture from this industry as it continues to grow. In the discussion of social justice, it has been and continues to be a priority with the task force. The 7 recommendations we made began with the questions of what are the characteristics of an equitable business ownership structure and workforce development structure. Sorry. Thank you. For the cannabis industry. The task force intent was to make recommendations that would commit San Francisco to helping repair the damage to communities most impacted from the war on drugs. We commend the district attorney's office for proactively expunging thousands of misdemeanor cannabis convictions and to review thousands more for reductions and resentencing. This action will help ensure equitable employment opportunities and also the opportunity for business ownership. Diversity belongs in ownership as well as in the workforce. We have recommended that the city support equity applicants by providing technical assistance and possible zero-interest loans. We recommend San Francisco allocate revenue from local cannabis taxes and/or cannabis funds received from the state to go towards education programs and workshops, loans for equity cannabis businesses, and to nonprofits. Workforce training and job opportunities for impacted communities is another important recommendation we have made. San Francisco should ensure existing workforce protections are extended to this industry. The labor peace requirement for cannabis businesses is an important opportunity for workers to have access and understand their rights to act collectively. As the union labor representative seat, I have encouraged and supported the participation of our workforce in a state-registered apprenticeship program. Also, working with First Source for local hire helps ensure that a broader selection of San Francisco workers are the people that benefit most from having a sustainable cannabis industry. Social justice and equity is an issue that touches all categories of this industry. The task force will use due diligence as we continue our work into year 3.
Thank you, Supervisors. Terrence Allen back again to talk about agency oversight. You've heard the words permit portability mentioned 1 or 2 times during our discussion, and it is an area that within agency oversight, we would like to, as a task force, take the subject up and bring the issue forward so that a permit given to a particular location when they outgrow or that location is no longer appropriate does not have to abandon the work involved in getting that permit, but there is some methodology for portability. I don't believe we are suggesting it be like a liquor license, so they become horse-traded commodities. But I do believe that as communities evolve, our permitting system within San Francisco has to accommodate the necessity of moving this business from here to there. Also in agency oversight, the task force had many discussions about what is the best interface between individuals that are working within the system, now overseen by the Office of Cannabis, and are having a challenge, or individuals that are part of the community in which a business would like to open, having interactions with the Office of Cannabis and the applicant and having a challenge, and decisions that are made being challenged by both. In order to do that, one thought that was brought forward by the task force was an independent commission. I respect and honor the discussion that was had at the board, and so the task force brings this up only as a point of reference and now moves its agreement to a hearing officer. So as long as there is a process by which someone in dispute can move beyond the initial individuals working on the project, I believe that it will satisfy the need for third-party review of any dispute. We're happy that the Office of Cannabis is standalone. Thank you for that. And let's move on. The important one, year 3. What framework and vision should we have? And supervisors, if I can have your attention for the next 2 minutes, it would be great, because there will be a leading question at the end of this presentation for you. So, year 2, our recommendation categories morphed. They became more aligned with what the legislative intent was going to be. Now, year 3, we're shifting again into 3 areas. We recommend that we shift to regulatory, land use, equity, and social justice. We believe as a task force leadership team that these will be the 3 areas most needing the kind of community input and facilitation that the task force can do. And then, of course, you'll see on the side, cross-cutting. Cross-cutting is a subject which occurs in all 3. As you heard, consumption, social justice, and equity, those are cross-cutting. You cannot have a regulatory discussion without considering social justice and equity. So in our proposed year 3 vision, and this is where a little attention is needed because you're going to guide us in what we actually do. In the regulatory side, you heard about compassion. It was bookmarked in the legislation. Thank you very much for that bookmark. Now we need to build that compassion program out, and we need to involve the office through its regulatory process initially, and if there is a requirement for legislation, come back to the board, remembering that compassion was the purpose that medical cannabis was born. And I'll just take a moment now. 2 weeks ago on Saturday, we lost the pioneer who made medical marijuana, and you notice I say medical cannabis, but the pioneer who made medical marijuana, Dennis Peron, a thing almost 50 years ago. His single-handed and single-minded approach that cannabis belongs in patients' hands and it belongs in appropriate hands, and it should not be an illegal substance. It should be something that we use in our compassion, our giving, in our society, has led us to where we are today. And with this mention, I would just like us to note that without Dennis Peron, I don't think we would be having this particular discussion today. And I thank him for his labor of work and memorialize his passing. Also in regulatory, there is the fun part, events. We need to provide a vehicle by which San Francisco can participate in the event system that has grown up around cannabis. Currently, the state does not allow any space in San Francisco to be licensed for events, and so this is a dual-pronged effort. Through the advocacy and political will building at the task force, we can bring suggestions both to you and the Office of Cannabis with some force behind them, and together take them to the state and ask that they expand the way in which events are seen so that we don't end up with Hippie Hill on 420 and nobody knows what to do about it. The leadership of Mayor Lee last year brought that into the city. The regulatory framework now pushes it back out of the city. We've got to fix that. Youth as well. Youth diversion has been a big issue throughout the legislative process at the state, and here the task force stands firm. One of our voting members on the task force is a San Francisco Unified School District employee, which is unusual. It's the only voting member who is a what I would call a department employee, and that is to underscore the necessity of having youth considerations in all the decisions that we make. In equity programs for year one, and workforce protections, and in land use, you'll see some broad categories, such as, remember when we created the legislation, we took the tours out of land use. We took the tour capability and said, we have to study that for a year. What an ideal petri dish to do that study the task force would be, so that it could bring back recommendations to you as the board members and the Office of Cannabis, so that we can create a tour program to once again keep San Francisco on the cutting edge. All of you that went on a tour with me, I believe, came away from that tour knowing and learning something that you did not know, that you couldn't have gotten from a book and would have been very impossible to get from just sitting down with an individual or even looking at a YouTube video. Tours are a necessity. San Francisco is a tourist destination. How we weave that together and respect the industrial land in which most of the non-retail businesses are located is going to be tricky, and that's where the task force can step in. And the big question that everyone asks me as I walk around the neighborhood is, when is my corner store going to have a cannabis shelf? In other words, accessory use. Accessory use, again, a bookend. Whether it is the conversation of this year or next, it will be a conversation pushed by our small businesses who are seeing profitability in cannabis retail and want to participate in that opportunity. And as we evolve this system in 1, 2, maybe 3 years, we'll be ready for that conversation. The task force would like to bring that up as part of its year 3 vision. And of course, consumption. We cannot get away from the fact that people will buy and they need to consume. And the way the legislation came out of Sacramento, it has to be in a private residence with the permission of the landlord. That is very difficult to get if you live in Germany and you're coming here for 2 weeks. We don't want to be pushing our tourists to Airbnbs. We just created a system that took the pressure off our housing stock by limiting Airbnbs. We don't want to put the pressure back on Airbnbs to be the only place where cannabis tourists can legally consume with the permission of their landlord. Back up in regulatory and in the sphere of equity, we have state tax and local tax. There is going to be a conversation about local excise tax at this board. There will be a ballot initiative. I am almost certain of that. And so what is the appropriate tax rate, and where do we get to the point in our taxes that the price of cannabis, with the tax coming out of the state, the excise tax and the sales tax, make it more economically viable for customers to go to the black market? Right now, we're seeing almost an 80% increase at the retail shelf. At what point, by adding an excise tax, will we make that a doubling of the price that you can get it on the corner from your weed dealer? We don't want to go back to that system, so let's not allow the tax discussion to fail to bring in that consideration, and the task force would be an excellent place for that discussion to happen. And then finally, regulatory equity and land use all overlap in data. We cannot move forward without getting data. We have an excellent director in the Office of Cannabis who understands the need for data, who is going to help me understand my next slide, which talks about how data inculcates with our system. But methods of collection and the scope of what we need in the first year's data, we need to decide now so that we can start collecting it. And year 1 regulatory program analysis. So the task force is unique. It can look over the shoulder of the Office of Cannabis and hear both from its participants in the regulatory process, the applicants, hear from the equity community, is it working? And hear from our neighbors, is it working? We will be in the unique position to provide that analysis, and we will do so with your blessing. Now, what is this? Review of minimal viable system. I like talking about this because I'm learning about it as I speak. You probably know much more about it than I do. But what I'm understanding is that the Office of Cannabis is being set up as a model for how online programs can be used to gather data and make sure that that data is complete and send that data to the appropriate departments for review. So in this minimum viable system, we have not only those things that happen within the, I get a permit, I need to go to step 1, step 2, step 3, but then we also have the pre-application requirements to make sure that you are an equity applicant or that you do have an appropriate number of equity employees. All of those things need to be data pointed and happen within the minimal viable system. So I probably fumbled that a great deal, but I wanted you to know that the Cannabis Department is on the cutting edge of this technology, and I think it's going to help us. We're going to get data like we haven't seen before. Now, in conclusion, and this is the part where I ask for your insight, our Year 3 vision is outlined in this final slide. You saw it before. Where have we missed an issue that you as the board would like us to take up as we move forward and set our agendas for the next year? If we've done great, I thank you very much. If you think of something in your sleep and text it, that's great. If there's something now that you would like us to bring forward or talk about, I open this up for your conversation.
Is that the end of your presentation?
And then I have a thank you slide.
Oh, okay.
For all of the people that were here. They were thanked at the beginning, and our website so that you can find the information that was presented here today. And thank you for your time, supervisors.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen and Ms. Garcia and Pan as well for your work on this presentation, and our director and everyone who's been trying to help us navigate this new era here in San Francisco. I appreciate the overview of the work that you've done in the past, as well as a highlight or preview of what you've done or what you plan to do in the future as well. I really do like that you have a portion on here regarding youth. I do think that's really important, and a lot of the youth in our district, through our youth council that we have in District 4, we're very curious about this topic. In fact, it might be one that they are adopting to work on this year because they want to also understand better how it is that they talk to their peers about it. How do they understand, kind of what's available to them or not, and so forth. So, and I see, oh, no, you're not getting up to talk about it. Okay, so we don't need to do this here, but I would like to see what that outreach and education plan is for youth, and how that the San Francisco Unified School District as a whole is going to kind of institutionalize this type of outreach to our youth.
Thank you, Supervisor. I've made that note, and we'll make sure that it is included.
Okay. Is there any evidence from the Department of Health? We are in partnership currently with this Unified School District and DCYF to work together in collaboration. I've already met with the Wellness Center counselors to brief them about this, and we will also be working with them, and we'll be happy to work with your youth council to engage, especially as we do our social marketing campaign.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Supervisor Safai.
Thank you, Chair Tang. Just a couple comments. I know that, first of all, I think that the task force did a tremendous job of informing us throughout the process when we were crafting our legislation. We had the good fortune of having many knowledgeable and talented people. I think the tour that we participated in our office was very beneficial. I don't know if all the supervisors participated in that, but I know that many of them did, and I know that that was something that was very influential in terms of, and impactful in terms of the way I was able to approach crafting the legislation. Also, I think that the idea of, I know you highlighted a couple of things, one of which we tried to solve for and have conversations around portability. The biggest hurdle in portability has to do with the fact that the regulatory and the entitlement have to do with, it is a land use conversation, and then to essentially take that in terms of your licensing, we did provide for the mobility of the license, but it didn't remove the requirement that a new location would have to go through the land use process all over again. And I don't think there's any way we're going to be able to remove that as much as we would like it to. But what we did do which I think that was really important, was allow for and control for the amount of ownership that the particular permit could be sold under and how much ownership had to remain in the hands of. And so we had some instances where property owners came in and bought properties and then did not renew the lease of the permit holders, and were hopeful that they would then immediately assume that designation. In some cases they did, but I think we were able to, and correct me if I'm wrong, task force, but I believe that we were able to solve for that in the sense that just because you have the land use designation doesn't mean you immediately assume the permit. And so we work really closely with Director Elliott on that, as well as the task force and others and the Department of Public Health. So I think it was an iterative process. I think there was a lot of good leadership on behalf of departments, the task force, the Office of Cannabis, my colleagues, and I think we got to a really good place. We are going to have a conversation about taxing. I think the taxing of this use is imminent. The state will come up with a number, and the city and county of San Francisco, because of a lot of the needs with regard to health, with regards to equity, with regard to all the other desires, it is a conversation that's going to move forward in a very rapid manner, probably after the June election, but maybe even sooner than that. So we should engage on that conversation. And then other than that, I just want to say appreciate the conversation. I would like to echo what Supervisor Tang said. Because of the expansion of retail use, the knowledge and the access and the exposure of youth has gone up exponentially. That's not to say that anything is really negative about that, but I think that it's important that we have a real conversation, because the folks that will be exposed to a broader variety of cannabis on the market, whether it's the secondary or tertiary market after folks that are buying it through this expanded retail accessibility, we have to have a real full-blown conversation about how we're disseminating that information. I appreciate the work that the Department of Public Health is doing with our school district. It's also important to include, as you said, the Department of Children, Youth, and Family, because there are those that are no longer in school, that are out of school, that are hopefully accessible through the nonprofit networks that we have in the city. And it's just about providing information and knowledge and understanding. And I think that actually might be a good thing in terms of the expansion of the retail. At least there's a little bit more knowledge about the strands and the usage and the dosage of THC levels versus just buying something on the street and not really necessarily knowing exactly what's out there. So that then there's going to be generally, what I'm saying is there's generally going to be more knowledge out in the general public, hopefully. And I think the Department of Public Health has a key role to play in that. And that way we will be very protective of our youth in general. So thank you for your presentation today. We appreciate and look forward to continued conversation.
Thank you, Supervisor Safai. And of course, again, thank you to everyone who's been working on this. I myself am first and foremost very interested in just how the legislation that we just passed at the board will shake out, in addition to everything that you presented today. But I think that all of that will be very helpful in guiding us in your future work as well, and any other input that we want to provide. So we'll certainly all be thinking about that. So I see that there are no other questions from this truncated committee here. So I will open up this hearing, item 4, to public comment. If anyone wants to speak, come on up.
Hello, thanks, Supervisor Tang, Supervisor Saeed. My name is Jesse Stout. I live here in the neighborhood. I'm on the San Francisco Cannabis State Legalization Task Force, seat 9 these past 2 years. And thank you so much for passing this wonderful legislation 2 months ago in December that's enabled San Francisco's cannabis industry to begin the process of becoming state licensed. Appreciate that. A couple areas from the presentation and others that I wanted to highlight. First, the issue of consumption of cannabis, that currently the city has allowed a few of the cannabis retailers, I think 8 of them in total, to have consumption spaces within the retail floor spaces, but that's not accessible for most people who either would like to use cannabis in their home, might have trouble with their landlord, and there's just not going to be enough physical space in 8 retailers for all the people who want to use cannabis in San Francisco legally. So we want to avoid a situation where people are going to use cannabis in the park or on the street corner. We'd instead prefer to allow some kind of space where people can go to use cannabis within city law and not run afoul of city or state law. So in order to avoid people getting tickets that they can't afford to pay, we'd prefer if the board could continue to work on this legislation to provide a place where people can go for safe consumption of cannabis. Another area that's important that we mentioned earlier is compassion programs. It's wonderful that the new legislation has this sentence about the city will continue to allow compassion programs. We have, however, a conflict with state law where the state regulations currently only allow for free medicine to be given out to people who've qualified already as medical patients. So we would ask that the city both lobby the state and expand city law to allow compassion programs for anyone who can't afford it, rather than only people who have already gone through the expensive city card process. And most finally, I'd ask that the supervisors and the board to see our recommendation about the funding for equity applicants. We're concerned that the new equity businesses might not be able to get bank loans, and it'd be great if the city budget could include low-interest loans for these businesses.
Thank you very much for the suggestion. Any other members of the public who wish to speak on item 4, please come on up.
Hi, my name is Wilson Chu. I am with the Chinese American Democratic Club. I would respectfully ask the Rules Committee to reject all recommendations coming from the task force. It's been over a year of activism that's come from the neighborhoods, and nothing of these recommendations come to support or address any of the needs of the neighborhoods. I find that somewhat, I find that offensive. I find that very offensive. Since the last time I've spoken in front of the board and in front of planning, two and a half months has passed, and there's been a lot of people that's reached out to me. 2 of the top concerns that I've heard is cannabis grow within homes, rented homes. The second issue that I have come across that I've heard from the community is high school students having access to vaporized cannabis oils obtained from 18-and-a-half-year-olds. These concerns of families and neighborhoods have not been addressed, and until the neighborhoods' concerns are addressed, I would respectfully ask that everything from the task force be rejected until there are some resolutions to the neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public who wish to speak on item 4? Okay, seeing none, public comment is closed on this item. I think that perhaps if the task force could work with some of the members of the public who had brought up suggestions, I think that would be really great. For example, I don't know if you heard earlier that we had chatted about the focus for youth and how it is that we do education outreach. I do think that is really important. So again, I was glad to hear that you through SFUSD and DPH have a plan moving forward, and perhaps we could do a better job to share with the public what exactly that is. Supervisor Safai, you had something else?
Yes. I just wanted to, the last comment by the previous speaker that's on the task force, just something to highlight for the task force members, and maybe they can report back to us next time, as well as maybe the Office of Cannabis. One of the things that we heard from industry folks is that because of the way we drew the equity rules, that there were a lot of existing cannabis owners that had employees and other folks that were qualifying members in terms of the parameters that we set for equity applicants, that they were interested in working to invest and work with them as well. So I'd like to see a report on how that is starting to, I mean, not necessarily a report, but you all can report to us, not a written report, but you can report to us on what you're seeing in the industry as we're moving forward, because the way the rules are set, the next 50 plus applications that have to be approved have to be equity applicants. And so what we were getting some initial feedback was that there were existing operators that were looking to invest and work with and help to grow, no pun intended, the equity applicants and their ability to expand. So it would be interesting to see how they're planning on doing that. And just as a last speaker, you did miss our conversation, the requests that we had in terms of education and outreach and how we were informing youth in this process, particularly high school students. So we had quite a bit of conversation on that. Director Elliott, did you want to say something?
Director Elliott.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Supervisor Safai likes to pretend he's chair.
Sorry. Sorry.
Supervisors
I thought I
Nicole
was still
Elliott,
speaking.
Director of the Office
Sorry.
of Cannabis. I just want to put a plug in for our website, which is officeofcannabis.sfgov.org. And on that website is a meeting page that does give every member of the public a sense of when we will be holding task force meetings. And we encourage members of the public to attend and participate in those meetings so that the recommendations of the task force are advised by members of the public as well. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that. Okay, so are there any other comments or
I didn't
questions?
have anything else to
Okay.
say.
All right. Well, thank you again. I know that this is ongoing conversation that we're all going to have and be monitoring pretty closely. But I think for today's purposes, we are going to close this hearing. That was again called by Supervisor Cohen. I think we'll try to make a motion to file this hearing. Okay. All right. We'll do that without objection. Thank you. All right, Mr. Clerk, are there any other items before us today?
That completes the agenda for today.
Okay. Thank you. This meeting is adjourned.